Now, concerns mounted or have recently mounted over the rising trend of government officials signing loan agreements with a clause that does waive the sovereign immunity of the country if it defaults in its repayment plan. Last week, Nigeria's House of Representatives summoned the Minister of Transportation, that is Honorable Rotimi Amechi, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, and the Minister of Digital Communications and Digital Economy, Alhaji Isa Pantami, over a loan agreement with China which contained the waiver clause. And to look at this in more detail, let's speak to Tom FOWDY, who specializes in China-Africa relations. He's also a journalist with the Southern African Times. Tom, it's great to see you today, and I'm sure you heard my introduction. Recently, a lot of concerns have mounted over a particular clause that does seem to waive sovereign immunity. And people have confirmed or have referred this or compared it rather to what we saw in 2018 in Zambia, where they had similar clauses in contracts with China, and that ended in China taking over the Zambia Broadcasting National Corporation, and also talks began to take over the international airport and one other big asset of the country. What do you make of all of this?
Well, what I make of it is that sovereign immunity is just depicted here in contractual terms, and it does not mean specifically that China is going to besiege or take over Nigerian state assets if it fails to repay its debt obligations. Rather, what the contract is entailing is that the Nigerian state ought to meet its debt obligations to China rather than simply defaulting. It's a commercial agreement. I think what we should understand is that the Chinese state does respect the sovereignty of African states, and beginning in the 1950s and 60s, the bedrock of China-Africa relations is based on a principle that the sovereignty of the two countries in their relationships are non-negotiable. So China is not using this to dominate Africa. China is not using this to take over or besiege the assets of African states. It's just a contractual provision, and I believe it would be very much negotiable.
Tom, you've just mentioned something, and that's the same response China had over the same issue. But if that's the case, why then impute that particular clause in the contract? That's what is getting everyone worried.
I believe it's to ensure that Nigeria does meet its debt obligations. You know, a loan is still commercial, but I do not believe that is beyond the provision of negotiations between the two governments in particular. I don't believe that it is something to be overly worried about. We hear a lot about this so-called debt trap diplomacy, but it seeks to portray China's lending in predatory terms. It's a negative discourse insinuated, particularly by Western and anti-China powers, which seeks to portray China's behavior in coercive and expansionist ways. But I really do not believe that such is the case. It's more a guarantee, because, you know, you can't take a loan from a bank in any particular circumstances and simply default on it. There has to be guarantees that you can meet your debt obligations, that you can pay it back in order to be, you know, a reliable contractor to your particular creditor.
Okay, Tom. So in terms of the future then, especially post-pandemic, of China-Africa relations, what do you foresee? And would you highlight any key risks that you can see for Africa going forward?
Well, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic is a huge challenge for the African continent, and especially in terms of its economic development. It's going to slow down growth, it's going to cause problems, and it's going to need, I agree, it's going to need a lot of assistance. And because of that, I definitely agree with the idea that China should continue to pursue debt relief measures, extensions of loans, and other humanitarian assistance for the continent. I believe that China needs to deliver its promises, assist Africa in terms of medical supplies, aid and equipment, and also, as it is pledged, to provide the vaccine when it finally researches it. So I definitely think that this situation is going to be more about what China can offer to Africa in terms of aid and support, because the continent is going to need it. So I definitely agree with the premise that it needs to be lenient on its debt obligations accordingly.
All right, analysts in the UK and the US have always been skeptical about China's true intentions towards the continent of Africa. Has this not just only worsened their biggest fears? Or what does China need to do to probably show their noblest of intentions?
I don't believe that China needs to show anything other than to the African people itself. I mean, from your experience, you should understand from an African perspective, that the West has also colonized Africa, that it claims that it has good intentions, but of course has pursued centuries worth of predatory and exploitative measures towards the continent. And I believe it's on that premise that makes China-Africa relations in general so strong and immune to the rhetoric that the West espouses. I believe a lot of the things coming particularly from America right now is geopolitical rather than legitimate concerns. And they're not so much interested in the best interests of African people, but their own geopolitical goals and objectives accordingly. But obviously, on the ground in Africa, China definitely needs to prove that it is an all-weather friend. It needs to, like I said, be considerate of the situation, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the obvious economic repercussions, and it needs to prove that it can continue to offer support to the people of Africa rather than just in the framework of commercialism and making money. It states that these ties are based in historical solidarity and the historical roots of post-colonial global South-South cooperation rather than just commercialism. So it needs to stick to these principles and stick to these paths. And the people of Africa should look for those signs rather than just to heed the rhetoric from Western powers who have a continual history of dominating Africa, claiming that it's persevering in their best interests.
Tom, thank you for joining us on Newsday and sharing your views. I must say, as a Nigerian, it still does scare me to see that our sovereign immunity could be waved away based on a contract, but it is good to get that research perspective and a more solid perspective of what this means. Thank you for taking away a bit of our worry this afternoon. Tom FOWDY, political and international relations analyst with the Southern African Times.